A 1903 wedding photo reappears, and historians go silent after enlarging one detail. The autumn rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the Whitfield Antique Gallery in Baltimore, creating a rhythm that had become familiar to those who worked within its walls. The scent of old wood and aged paper hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of the Earl Grey tea cooling on the workbench. Outside, the streets of the historic Fells Point neighborhood glistened with moisture, but inside, time seemed to move at its own pace. Daniel Crawford adjusted the lamp on his restoration table, directing more light onto the pile of items he had acquired that morning. At 47, Daniel had spent more than 2 decades buying and selling antique photographs, but his true passion was restoration, bringing life back to images that time had nearly consumed. His gallery occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, a space filled with the treasures and forgotten memories of countless families. The collection before him had come from a foreclosed property in Frederick, Maryland. The previous owner had passed away with no known relatives, and the contents of her home had been sold at auction. Daniel had purchased 3 boxes of photographs and documents sight unseen, a gamble he often took in hopes of finding something remarkable. Most of what he found was unremarkable. Faded snapshots from the 1960s, a stack of damaged postcards, school portraits with water stains that rendered the faces nearly unrecognizable, tourist photographs from Atlantic City and Ocean City. He sorted through them methodically, setting aside anything worth salvaging, discarding what could not be saved. But then his hands stopped moving. At the bottom of the second box, protected by a layer of yellowed tissue paper, lay a large photograph in an ornate silver frame. The frame itself was tarnished but intact, decorated with delicate floral patterns that suggested quality craftsmanship. Daniel lifted it carefully, wiping dust from the glass with his sleeve. The photograph showed a wedding scene from the early 20th century. The composition was formal, typical of the Edwardian era. A young bride sat in an elaborately carved chair, her white gown cascading around her in waves of silk and lace. Standing beside her was the groom, a tall man in a dark formal suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. Behind them, a painted backdrop depicted a garden scene with columns and roses. The bride was beautiful, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair arranged in the Gibson girl style popular during that period. Her dress featured a high collar, fitted bodice, and long sleeves that ended in points over her hands. She wore long white gloves that extended past her wrists. A delicate veil crowned her head, and she held a bouquet of roses in her lap. But it was the bride's face that drew Daniel's attention. She was smiling, as brides in such photographs always did. But there was something wrong with that smile. It seemed frozen, almost painted on, not reaching her eyes, and her eyes themselves held an expression that Daniel could not immediately name. In his years of studying antique photographs, he had learned to read the subtle language of faces captured in silver and sepia. This woman's eyes spoke of something far from the joy that wedding portraits were meant to capture. Daniel had examined thousands of photographs from this era. He knew the stiffness that came from long exposure times, the awkwardness of formal poses, the discomfort of restrictive clothing. This was different. Something in this image nagged at him, triggering an instinct developed over decades of study. He retrieved his magnifying loupe from the drawer and began examining the photographs systematically. The clothing and hairstyles were consistent with that date. The photographic technique was excellent, with clear focus and good tonal range. Then he moved his examination to the bride's hands. Something was not right. Even through the fabric of her white gloves, he could see discoloration. At first, he thought it might be damage to the photograph itself, foxing or chemical deterioration, but the marks were too deliberate, too localized. They appeared specifically around her wrists, visible through the thin silk of her gloves. Daniel's pulse quickened. He needed higher magnification. He carefully removed the photograph from its frame and placed it on his scanner, capturing a high-resolution digital image. On his computer screen, he enlarged the image, focusing on the bride's wrists. His breath caught in his throat. The gloves could not fully conceal what lay beneath them. Around both wrists, clearly visible when enlarged, were dark marks, bruises, the distinctive purple-yellow discoloration of healing contusions. The marks formed bands around her wrists, as if something had been tied there, as if she had been restrained. But there was more. On the hand that rested on top of the bouquet, the glove had shifted slightly, revealing a sliver of bare skin. And on that skin was another mark, a small but distinct scar, a healed wound that formed a deliberate pattern. Daniel sat back slowly, his mind racing. The photograph was meant to capture the happiest day of this young woman's life. She sat in her beautiful gown, her new husband's hand on her shoulder, surrounded by all the symbols of matrimonial bliss. Yet the evidence on her wrists told a story of violence that contradicted everything the image was supposed to represent. The following morning, Daniel drove through the rain to the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis. The building rose like a temple to memory, its marble halls echoing with the footsteps of researchers seeking connections to the past. He had called ahead, requesting access to marriage records and photography studio registrations from the early 1900s. The reading room was hushed, filled with the soft sounds of turning pages and clicking keyboards. Daniel approached the main desk, where a woman in her 60s sat surrounded by reference books. He explained his research, showing her the high-resolution printout of the photograph. Virginia studied the image carefully, her expression shifting as she examined the bride's face and then, with Daniel's prompting, the marks visible on her wrists. "Morrison Photography," she murmured. "They were one of Baltimore's most prominent studios in that era. We have some of their business records, but not complete customer files." She led Daniel to a section of microfilm records, helping him load the appropriate reels. For 2 hours, he scrolled through blurred images of ledgers and receipts, searching for any record that matched the photograph. Finally, he found it. A studio appointment book from 1903, the entry dated June 14th. Hartwell Aldridge wedding portrait, bride. Miss Clara Hartwell, groom. Mr. Edmund Aldridge, rush order. Father of bride, paid in advance. Daniel felt a chill run through him. The bride had specifically requested gloves that would cover her wrists. She had known what she needed to hide. "If you are looking for more information about the families involved," Virginia said, looking over his shoulder, "you might find marriage certificates, social registry entries, even newspaper announcements. But for the social context of what you're seeing, I would recommend speaking with Dr. Lillian Shaw at Johns Hopkins. She specializes in women's history, particularly domestic conditions in the Gilded Age and Progressive era." Daniel wrote down the name, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Dr. Lillian Shaw's office occupied a corner of the history department at Johns Hopkins University, a cluttered sanctuary of books, papers, and archival boxes. The walls were covered with photographs and documents related to women's history, and a vintage typewriter sat on a shelf like a museum piece. Dr. Shaw herself was a woman in her late 50s, with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She examined Daniel's photograph for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave. "This poor woman," she said quietly. "What you are seeing is evidence of restraint." "Restraint," Daniel repeated. Dr. Shaw removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. In 1903, a woman had very few legal rights regarding marriage. If her father or guardian decided she would marry a particular man, she had little recourse. Women were considered the property of their fathers until marriage, at which point they became the property of their husbands. She pulled a thick volume from her bookshelf and opened it to a marked section. "I have documented dozens of cases from this era of women who were forced into marriages against their will. Some were locked in their rooms for weeks. Others were beaten into submission." Daniel felt sick. Who would stop it? The police? The courts? They were all part of the same system that considered women property. Domestic violence was not even a legal concept. A husband could discipline his wife as he saw fit. The phrase was, quote, "with a rod no thicker than his thumb." She pointed to the photograph. This young woman, Clara Hartwell, was likely held against her will in the days before her wedding. The restraints were removed just long enough for this portrait to be taken. She requested long gloves to hide the evidence, probably knowing that this photograph would be displayed in her new home, shown to visitors, preserved for posterity. Dr. Shaw's expression darkened. "That depends entirely on the man she married." "Edmund Aldridge, you said?" "I would need to research the name, but I can tell you statistically that women who entered marriages under these circumstances often faced continued abuse. Some escaped, some survived." She met Daniel's eyes. "If you can find more information about Clara Hartwell, you might be able to learn her story." Daniel's research intensified over the following weeks. He returned to the Maryland archives repeatedly, requesting marriage certificates, census records, city directories, and newspaper archives. The work was tedious, hours spent scrolling through microfilm and turning fragile pages, but slowly the fragments of a life began to emerge. Clara Hartwell was born in 1883 to a prominent Baltimore family. Her father, William Hartwell, was a successful shipping merchant. Her mother had died when Clara was young, leaving her to be raised by her father and a succession of governesses. The marriage certificate confirmed what the photograph had shown. On June 15, 1903, Clara Hartwell, age 20, married Edmund Aldridge, age 38, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Baltimore. Edmund Aldridge was listed as a businessman from Philadelphia with interests in rail and manufacturing. But it was the newspaper archives that revealed the most troubling information. Daniel found an article from the Baltimore Sun dated June 12, 1903, just 2 days before the wedding portrait was taken. The brief article stated that Miss Clara Hartwell was suffering from a nervous condition and was confined to her home under a physician's care. The wedding, originally scheduled for June 8th, had been postponed by 1 week. Another article, from June 16th, announced that the wedding had proceeded as planned. But between the lines, Daniel could read a different story. Clara had tried to escape, she had tried to refuse the marriage, and she had been confined until she could be forced to comply. He found Edmund Aldridge in the business pages of various newspapers. The man had been wealthy, well-connected, and apparently ruthless in his business dealings. Several articles mentioned lawsuits, disputes with partners, allegations of fraud that were never proven. The picture that emerged was of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but it was a small article from 1905 that changed everything. Aldridge's wife reported missing, the headline read. The brief notice stated that Mrs. Clara Aldridge had departed the family home in Philadelphia and her whereabouts were unknown. Mr. Aldridge had offered a reward for information leading to her return. She had escaped. 2 years after that wedding portrait was taken, Clara had run. Daniel searched frantically for more information. What had happened to her? Where had she gone? The trail seemed to go cold after 1905. Clara Aldridge simply vanished from the historical record until he found a different name. In a 1912 edition of a progressive women's magazine, Daniel found an article about women's shelters in New York City. The article profiled several women who ran homes for wives fleeing abusive husbands. One of them was identified as Mrs. Clara had not just escaped, she had changed her name, presumably remarried, and dedicated her life to helping other women escape the same fate she had endured. The genealogical research took another week, but Daniel finally traced Clara's descendants to a woman living in upstate New York. Margaret Sullivan was 73 years old, the great-granddaughter of Clara through her second marriage. Daniel's hands trembled as he dialed her number. Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Daniel Crawford. I'm an antique photograph restorer in Baltimore. I recently acquired a photograph that I believe shows your great-grandmother, Clara Hartwell, on her wedding day in 1903. There was a long pause on the line. Then, a voice thick with emotion. Her first wedding day. The one she spent her whole life trying to forget. How did you find that photograph? 2 days later, Daniel sat in Margaret Sullivan's living room in a small town near Rochester. The house was modest but warm, filled with family photographs spanning multiple generations. Margaret herself was a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and Clara's cheekbones, a family resemblance that transcended a century. Daniel placed the photograph on the coffee table between them. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, tears forming in her eyes. I have heard about this photograph my entire life, she said softly. My grandmother Clara spoke of it with such hatred. She told me everything. Margaret rose and retrieved a worn wooden box from a cabinet. These are her journals, her letters, her records. She opened the box and lifted out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This is her own account of what happened. Margaret began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. They confined me to my bedroom for 11 days before the wedding. My father had discovered my plan to flee, to take passage on a ship to England, where I had a distant cousin who had promised to take me in. He was enraged. He said I was an ungrateful child. That Mr. Order. Margaret turned the page. On the third day, when I tried to climb from my window, he had me tied to my bed. The servants who attended me were instructed to keep me bound except for meals and necessities. The physician he summoned prescribed laudanum to keep me calm. Daniel felt ill listening to these words, written over a century ago by a woman who had suffered such cruelty. The gloves were my only victory, Margaret continued reading. I insisted upon them for the portrait, claiming they were fashionable. In truth, I could not bear for the marks to be visible, to be preserved for all time. I wanted to hide the evidence of my father's crime. But I know now that I was wrong. The evidence should have been preserved. Margaret closed the journal gently. She wrote over 300 pages. Margaret's expression hardened. Edmund Aldridge was a cruel man. He believed he had purchased Clara, and he treated her accordingly. The beatings began on their wedding night and never stopped. She was not allowed to leave the house unaccompanied. She was not allowed to correspond with anyone without his approval. With help, one of the household servants, a woman named Helen, recognized what was happening and conspired with Clara to plan an escape. They waited until Edmund was away on business. Margaret pulled out another document, a newspaper clipping from 1910. It showed a photograph of a group of women standing in front of a brownstone building. In the center was Clara, now in her late 20s, her expression fierce and determined. This is the Sullivan Street Women's Shelter in New York City. Clara founded it in 1908 with money she earned working as a seamstress. She had married Thomas Sullivan by then, a kind man who supported her work completely. More than that, she became an advocate, a voice for change. She testified before legislative committees. She wrote articles for newspapers and magazines. Margaret lifted another document from the box. This is a letter from 1915, addressed to the New York State Legislature, signed by Clara and 47 other women who had survived abusive marriages. Margaret smiled sadly. She lived until 1952, to the age of 69. She saw women gain the right to vote. She saw some progress in divorce laws. She saw the beginnings of recognition that domestic violence was a crime. She reached into the box one more time and pulled out a photograph. It showed an elderly Clara, white-haired but still sharp-eyed, surrounded by a group of women of various ages. This was taken in 1948 at a reunion of women who had passed through her shelter over the years. There are over 50 women in this photograph. Daniel looked at the photograph, then back at the wedding portrait from 1903. The same woman, separated by 45 years and a lifetime of struggle and triumph. He asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. For years, our family kept Clara's story private. She asked that her journals not be published during the lifetime of anyone who had known her, to protect them from retribution. She met Daniel's eyes. Clara wanted her story told. She wanted people to know what happened to women like her, what they endured, how they fought back. The full story of Clara Hartwell emerged over the months that followed. Born into privilege in 1883, she had been raised to be ornamental, educated in the accomplishments expected of a society wife with no thought given to her own desires or ambitions. Her father had viewed her as an asset to be traded for business advantage, and when Edmund Aldridge offered a substantial sum for her hand, the deal was made without Clara's consent or even her knowledge. Clara had met Edmund only twice before their engagement was announced. She found him cold and controlling, and when she learned of his reputation for violence toward servants and business associates, she begged her father to reconsider. He refused. The marriage contract had been signed. Breaking it would cost him financially and damage his reputation. When Clara attempted to flee, her father's response was swift and brutal. The 11 days of confinement left physical scars that took months to heal and psychological wounds that never fully closed. She was dragged to the altar in a daze, still sedated from the laudanum that had been forced upon her. The wedding night confirmed her worst fears. Edmund Aldridge believed that he had purchased not just a wife, but a possession, and he treated her with the same callousness he showed toward any object in his ownership. The first beating came within hours of the ceremony. Many more followed over the 2 years of their marriage. Clara's escape in 1905 was an act of extraordinary courage. She fled with nothing, knowing that as a married woman she had no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property, could not sign contracts, could not even keep wages she might earn. Edmund had the law entirely on his side. She survived through the kindness of strangers, through the growing network of women who helped each other escape abusive situations, through her own determination to never again be anyone's property. When she met Thomas Sullivan, a union organizer who believed passionately in women's rights, she found a partner who saw her as a person, not a possession. Together they built the shelter that would save hundreds of lives over the following decades. Clara became a leader in the early women's rights movement, working alongside suffragettes and reformers to change the laws that had enabled her own abuse. She testified before Congress. She wrote articles that were published in major magazines. She organized, advocated, and never stopped fighting. Edmund Aldridge died in 1918, never having granted Clara a divorce. She was finally legally free only when he was gone, but by then she had built a life that needed no validation from any man. She continued her work until poor health forced her to slow down in the late 1940s, and she died peacefully in 1952, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of her second marriage. Her legacy lived on through the shelter, which operated until 1965, and through the many women whose lives she had touched. Several of them went on to become advocates themselves, carrying Clara's mission into the later decades of the 20th century. 6 months after Daniel first discovered the wedding photograph, he stood in a small gallery space at the Baltimore Museum of Art. The exhibition he and Margaret had created together occupied a single room, but it told a powerful story. At the center was Clara's wedding portrait, now professionally restored and displayed alongside the 1948 reunion photograph. Around them were panels explaining her story, excerpts from her journals, newspaper clippings documenting her advocacy work, and photographs of the Sullivan Street shelter. Margaret stood beside Daniel, watching visitors move through the space. A young woman paused before the wedding portrait, reading the caption that explained what the enlarged detail revealed. Her expression shifted from curiosity to horror to something like recognition. "This happened to my grandmother," she said quietly to her companion. "She never talked about it, but I found letters after she died." An older couple stood before the reunion photograph, reading the names of the women pictured. The woman wiped tears from her eyes. The man put his arm around her shoulder. A mother knelt beside her young daughter, explaining in simple terms what the exhibition meant. "This woman was very brave," she said. "Some people tried to hurt her and control her, but she fought back." Margaret turned to Daniel, her eyes bright with emotion. This is what Clara wanted. She wanted her story to help people understand what women endured and what they overcame. Daniel looked at the wedding portrait, seeing it now with completely different eyes. The forced smile, the haunted expression, the marks on her wrists hidden beneath silk gloves, all the evidence of suffering that had been captured inadvertently by the camera. But he also saw something else now. He saw the first chapter of a story of remarkable courage and resilience. He saw a woman who refused to be destroyed by the violence done to her, who transformed her pain into purpose, who dedicated her life to ensuring that other women would not suffer as she had suffered. "Clara spent years hating this photograph," Margaret said. She touched the glass gently. "But I think she would see it differently now. This photograph is proof of what she survived. It is evidence of the cruelty she endured and the strength she found to overcome it." A young man approached them hesitantly. He was perhaps 25, with the look of a graduate student. "Excuse me. This is Clara's great-great-granddaughter," Daniel said, gesturing to Margaret. The young man's eyes widened. "I'm studying women's history at Hopkins. Dr. Shaw mentioned this exhibition, said I had to see it. This is incredible, the documentation, the primary sources, the way the story is presented." Margaret smiled. Clara would have liked that. As the museum began to close for the evening, Daniel and Margaret stood alone before the wedding portrait. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the gallery, but Clara's face remained visible behind the glass. Daniel asked. Margaret considered the question. "I think she found purpose. She transformed her suffering into service. She took the worst thing that ever happened to her and used it to help thousands of other people. Whether that brought her peace, I cannot say." She looked at Daniel with gratitude. "Thank you for finding this photograph." Daniel shook his head. "Clara's story was always there, waiting to be found. I just happened to be the one who found it." They stood together in the fading light, looking at the young woman in the white gown, her forced smile, her hidden bruises, her indomitable spirit. A woman who had been bound but refused to stay captive. A woman who had been silenced but found her voice. A woman who had been treated as property but claimed her full humanity. And Clara's story, nearly lost to time, would now inspire generations to come.